Just 2 minutes ago, the British monarchy was thrust into chaos. A revelation so shocking, so unexpected, that even palace insiders are scrambling to contain the fallout. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, long considered one of the monarchy's most discreet figures, has broken ranks. And at the center of her stunning disclosure, Camilla, Queen Consort, and a secret alliance that was never meant to see the light of day. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The timing could not be more explosive. With the monarchy already navigating fragile public trust and internal strain, Sophie chose this precise moment to speak when attention was fixed elsewhere, when confidence seemed steady, when no one expected a fracture from within. This was not a whisper leaked through anonymous sources. It was a direct confrontation, delivered in a private meeting that was meant to be routine but quickly turned electric. Those present describe a shift in the air, a tightening silence, the unmistakable realization that something irreversible had just been set in motion. Sophie, composed but unyielding, reportedly laid out what she knew with a clarity that stunned even the most seasoned royal advisors. Inside Buckingham Palace, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Phones rang without pause, doors closed. Statements were drafted and redrafted, then withheld. There was no official denial, no swift dismissal, only a heavy, deliberate quiet that spoke louder than words. The phrase that sent shockwaves through the inner circle was almost surreal in its weight: disgraced foreign royalty. Not a distant rumor, not a misunderstood acquaintance. An alliance. The implication was chilling. An active, concealed partnership between the Queen Consort and a figure long exiled from grace on the world stage. For years, subtle inconsistencies had circulated in hushed conversations, unexplained meetings, unusual diplomatic gestures, private correspondences that bypassed traditional channels. Most were dismissed as coincidence or misinterpretation. But Sophie's revelation reframed everything. What once seemed like isolated anomalies now appeared interconnected, forming a pattern that could no longer be ignored. The emotional undercurrent was unmistakable. Betrayal. Not only personal betrayal, but institutional betrayal, an unspoken contract within the royal family fractured by secrecy. What makes this moment even more staggering is Sophie's reputation. She was never known for recklessness. Her loyalty had been unwavering, her discretion almost legendary. Which raises the question that now hangs heavily over the crown. What could possibly drive someone like her to risk everything? Because make no mistake, this was a risk. In exposing Camilla's alleged alliance, Sophie has not just challenged a senior royal figure. She has ignited a crisis that threatens to ripple far beyond palace walls. And yet, beneath the urgency and the panic, there is something else, an undercurrent of inevitability. As if this truth had been pressing against the surface for years, waiting for the right fracture to break through. The exposure may feel sudden, but the tension behind it has clearly been building in silence. The monarchy now stands at a crossroads, caught between denial and disclosure, loyalty and accountability. And, as the dust begins to stir rather than settle, one unsettling reality becomes impossible to ignore. But this wasn't a spontaneous act of rebellion, it was the culmination of years of quiet observation, hidden tensions, and a relationship that had been deteriorating behind closed palace doors. For decades, Sophie remained in the shadows, trusted, composed, and fiercely loyal. But what if that loyalty came at a cost? What if the very role that kept her silent also placed her dangerously close to secrets no one else was meant to uncover? Behind her calm demeanor was a woman watching everything and remembering more than anyone realized. She was often described as the monarchy's quiet backbone, the steady presence who never sought headlines yet somehow held everything together when storms threatened to tear the institution apart. While others commanded attention with grand speeches and dramatic narratives, Sophie built her influence through restraint. She listened more than she spoke, she observed more than she reacted. And in the rarefied air of royal life, where every gesture carries meaning and every silence hides implication, that made her uniquely powerful and uniquely burdened. Her proximity to the inner circle was not accidental. Over the years, she was invited into conversations few outsiders could imagine. Closed-door strategy sessions, sensitive diplomatic discussions, private reflections exchanged in moments of vulnerability. She became a confidant not because she demanded authority, but because she inspired trust. And with trust came access. Access to fragments of information that, taken alone, meant little but together began to form a pattern too unsettling to ignore. At first, the shifts were subtle. A hesitation before speaking, a slight withdrawal from certain gatherings, a careful choice of words when Camilla's name surfaced in private dialogue. Those closest to Sophie noticed the change but dismissed it as fatigue or the natural evolution of royal dynamics. Yet beneath her composed exterior, something was stirring, a question she could not silence, a doubt she could not easily dismiss. It began with inconsistencies, small ones. A meeting that appeared informal yet carried unusual secrecy. A charitable initiative that intersected with foreign interests in ways that seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. Correspondence that bypassed traditional channels. Sophie did not leap to conclusions, she cataloged details. She replayed conversations in her mind, testing them against what she knew of protocol and precedent. Each time, the discomfort grew sharper. There were moments quiet, almost imperceptible when she allegedly witnessed exchanges that did not align with the public narrative. A private assurance that contradicted an official statement. A relationship described as distant that seemed anything but. None of it was dramatic enough to spark immediate alarm. But together, the fragments suggested something coordinated, something carefully concealed. And then came the internal reckoning. Loyalty to the crown had shaped Sophie's identity. She believed in its continuity, its symbolism, its fragile balance between tradition and modern expectation. To question a senior royal was to risk destabilizing that balance. Yet to ignore what she was seeing felt like a deeper betrayal not just of the institution, but of her own conscience. The tension became personal. Sleepless nights, measured conversations. The quiet realization that silence, once her greatest strength, was becoming complicity. This was not the story of a sudden rebellion. It was the slow burn of awareness. The dawning understanding that proximity to power also meant proximity to truth, and sometimes to danger. Sophie had spent years perfecting the art of composure, but beneath that discipline was a mind connecting dots others refused to see. And as her unease solidified into conviction, one truth emerged with startling clarity. The source of this tension was not abstract, not procedural, but deeply personal. And at the center of Sophie's growing unease was a figure whose influence had always been controversial, but whose secrets, it now seems, ran far deeper than anyone imagined. She was never meant to wield this much power, or at least not this quietly. For years, Camilla, Queen Consort, operated behind the scenes, strategic, calculating, and always one step ahead. But what if her influence extended beyond Britain's borders? What if the alliances she built were not just political, but dangerously personal? Camilla's journey from controversial outsider to central pillar of the monarchy was not accidental. It was engineered through patience, resilience, and an unshakable understanding of how power truly functions. While others fought battles in headlines, she mastered the art of subtlety. She did not demand authority, she accumulated it. Conversation by conversation, relationship by relationship. Over time, her presence shifted from tolerated to indispensable. And in that transformation, something else evolved as well. Influence that operated not in public ceremonies, but in private corridors where real decisions take shape. Her reputation for behind-the-scenes maneuvering was never openly acknowledged, yet it was quietly respected, even feared within certain circles. Advisors learned that her opinions carried weight long before they were voiced formally. Invitations to private gatherings increasingly revolved around her availability. Diplomats, philanthropists, and foreign dignitaries found themselves navigating conversations that felt informal yet consequential. This was soft power at its most refined, influence without title, authority without declaration. And it worked. But as Sophie's suspicions sharpened, the pattern surrounding Camilla began to feel less like strategic networking and more like calculated alignment. There were whispers of communications that bypassed official diplomatic channels. Messages conveyed not through embassies or ministers, but through trusted intermediaries. Relationships described publicly as distant that seemed privately active. Each allegation, taken alone, could be dismissed as rumor. Together, they suggested something far more coordinated. The concept of soft power within royal dynamics is rarely discussed openly. It is the ability to shape outcomes through proximity, persuasion, and carefully curated loyalty. Camilla appeared to understand this instinctively. She cultivated connections not just within Britain's elite, but abroad. Cultural initiatives overlapped with international interests. Charitable engagements coincided with strategic visits, and occasionally, unexplained travel or private meetings slipped through the cracks of public scrutiny. Official schedules would remain silent, yet the ripple effects of those encounters would surface later in subtle policy shifts or unexpected endorsements. Sophie began noticing the gaps: unrecorded conversations, correspondence that never passed through customary oversight, a foreign name mentioned once in passing, then never again. It was not the existence of foreign contacts that raised concern. Royalty thrives on global relationships. It was the secrecy surrounding one particular figure, a royal once powerful, now disgraced. A name that had quietly vanished from press releases and ceremonial guest lists. And yet, traces of that connection seemed to linger around Camilla like a shadow that refused to fade. Early hints were faint but persistent. A shared initiative framed as coincidence. A diplomatic stance that aligned too neatly with the interests of this exiled royal house. An intermediary whose loyalties appeared divided. None of it was explosive on its own. But in the context of Sophie's growing unease, it became impossible to ignore. Because if Camilla had indeed formed an alliance beyond Britain's borders, an alliance with someone cast out from global respectability, the implications would be staggering. The deeper Sophie looked, the clearer it became that this was not about social acquaintance or distant diplomacy. It was about strategy, about positioning, about securing influence in ways that bypassed tradition and protocol. And as those realizations settled heavily into place, one question rose above all others, echoing with quiet urgency and dangerous curiosity. But who was this mysterious foreign royal, and why had their name been erased from public memory? Their name was once spoken with reverence until it wasn't. Cast out, discredited, and quietly buried beneath scandal. This foreign royal vanished from the world stage, but disappearance doesn't mean irrelevance. In fact, it may have made them more dangerous. Because while the world forgot them, someone in Britain's royal circle never did. Before the disgrace, they were seen as modern, charismatic, a symbol of continuity for their nation. They moved through diplomatic circles with confidence, forged economic partnerships, and cultivated influence far beyond ceremonial duties. Then came the unraveling. Allegations surfaced, whispers at first, then headlines. Accusations of political betrayal, financial misconduct, perhaps even darker compromises that threatened national stability. The fall was swift and humiliating. Titles were stripped. Public appearances canceled. Loyal allies retreated into silence. Exile followed, not necessarily geographic at first, but social and political. The message was clear. They were no longer welcome in the world's respectable royal circles, and yet exile has a strange way of sharpening ambition. Cut off from official platforms, this disgraced royal did not disappear into obscurity. Instead, they adapted. Investments shifted into private channels. Loyalists remained embedded in business networks and philanthropic organizations. Influence, once exercised openly, became discreet. It is often those who have lost everything publicly who operate most strategically in private. With nothing left to protect in reputation, they are free to maneuver without restraint. This is where Sophie's unease deepened, because evidence began to suggest that this fallen royal, despite public condemnation, maintained quiet relevance. Invitations to international forums surfaced under alternate banners. Advisory roles were whispered about but never confirmed. Financial footprints traced through intermediaries hinted at continued access to substantial resources. And somewhere within those quiet movements, Camilla's orbit appeared to intersect. The alleged meetings were never announced. No photographs, no press releases, no ceremonial handshakes. Instead, they were unexplained overlaps in travel itineraries, private gatherings labeled as personal engagements, and discreet intermediaries whose connections bridged both royal households. At first glance, each instance seemed innocent. Royal families often cross paths in unofficial capacities, but repeated patterns are harder to dismiss. The same cities, the same closed-door forums, the same mutual associates appearing in both circles. What could bind a reigning queen consort and a disgraced foreign royal together? Shared interests offer one possibility. Both understood the fragility of public image. Both navigated complex paths from controversy to relevance. Both recognized that soft power, when wielded carefully, can outlast formal authority. Perhaps there was strategic alignment, mutual benefit in shaping narratives, supporting initiatives that bypassed governmental scrutiny, or influencing global conversations through unofficial channels. If so, the alliance would not be emotional or impulsive, it would be calculated. And that calculation is precisely what makes the implications so explosive. A connection between Britain's royal inner circle and a figure officially cast out for scandal would ignite questions of judgment, transparency, and loyalty. It would raise concerns about hidden agendas, about external influence penetrating the crown's carefully guarded neutrality. The monarchy's strength rests not only on tradition, but on trust. Any suggestion that senior figures are engaging privately with controversial power brokers could fracture that trust in ways difficult to repair. For Sophie, this was no longer a matter of isolated suspicion. The disgraced royal was not a relic of past scandal. They were active, strategic, and possibly aligned with someone at the heart of Britain's monarchy. The more she examined the fragments, the more the pattern solidified into something unmistakable. And as those pieces locked into place, the chilling realization dawned that this was not a casual association or distant acquaintance. It was deliberate, structured, potentially transformative. As Sophie began connecting these dots, what she uncovered wasn't just a relationship, it was a coordinated alliance with consequences that could shake the monarchy itself. What if the signs were always there, but no one dared to look closely enough? A misplaced document, a suspicious visit, a coded message hidden in plain sight. Piece by piece, a pattern began to emerge. And once Sophie saw it, she couldn't unsee it. This wasn't coincidence. It was coordination. At first, the timeline looked harmless. A diplomatic summit here. A private charity gala there. Occasions where Camilla's schedule appeared routine, even commendable. But when Sophie began aligning those dates with the quiet reappearances of the disgraced foreign royal in global circles, the overlaps became difficult to dismiss. Events that seemed unrelated were occurring within days of one another. Initiatives launched in Britain echoed projects previously championed by the exiled royal abroad. It was as if two separate narratives were moving in parallel, carefully avoiding public intersection, yet subtly synchronized beneath the surface. The channels of communication were never formalized, never acknowledged. There were no state visits, no official memorandums. Instead, there were private couriers whose loyalties were ambiguous. Advisors who had served in both royal households at different times. Invitations extended under the guise of cultural exchange that concealed more strategic conversations. Sophie began to understand that influence does not always travel through embassies and ministries. Sometimes it travels hand to hand, word to word, shielded by discretion. The more she examined, the clearer the architecture of the alliance appeared. Overlapping agendas began to surface, shared philanthropic causes that conveniently opened doors to international stakeholders, financial initiatives that mirrored one another in structure and timing. Public statements from Camilla that, while diplomatically neutral, subtly aligned with positions beneficial to the disgraced royal's lingering interests. None of it was blatant. That was the brilliance of it. The collaboration, if it existed, was designed to look organic, almost accidental. Intermediaries played a crucial role. Figures within royal and diplomatic circles who operated comfortably in gray areas. They arranged informal gatherings, facilitated introductions, and smoothed over logistical details that never appeared on official records. These were individuals who understood the language of discretion, who recognized that the most powerful alliances are often those never publicly declared. Sophie noticed how certain names recurred in correspondence, how the same trusted aides seemed to orbit both Camilla and the exiled royals' network. It was subtle, but it was consistent. Over time, Sophie gathered fragments of copies of schedules, archived emails, notes from conversations that once felt insignificant. She was not acting as an adversary, she was seeking clarity. Yet with each fragment, the weight of realization grew heavier. This was not a fleeting association sparked by convenience. The pattern stretched back years, quietly, methodically. From early, seemingly innocent encounters to more recent, carefully shielded engagements, the connection evolved without public scrutiny. The most unsettling revelation was not that an alliance might exist, it was that it had likely been active for far longer than anyone suspected. Long enough to influence decisions, long enough to shape narratives, long enough to entrench itself within the monarchy's delicate web of relationships. Sophie could no longer interpret the inconsistencies as misunderstandings. The evidence, circumstantial though it may have seemed individually, formed a cohesive story. When viewed together, and with that clarity came an unavoidable truth. Exposing this would not simply embarrass a senior royal, it would fracture trust at the highest level. It would challenge the very principle of transparency the monarchy depends on to survive modern scrutiny. The deeper Sophie ventured into this labyrinth of quiet coordination, the more she understood that she was not just uncovering a secret, she was stepping into a storm. But discovering the truth was only the beginning, because exposing it would come at a cost Sophie may not have been prepared for. Silence can protect power, but it can also destroy integrity. For Sophie, the burden had become unbearable. Every secret she carried, every moment she stayed quiet, pushed her closer to a decision she could never undo. And then, something changed. Something happened that forced her hand and turned quiet observation into explosive revelation. For years, Sophie convinced herself that patience was loyalty, that discretion was strength. She told herself that preserving unity within the monarchy mattered more than airing suspicions that could fracture it. But secrets have weight. They linger in the mind, replaying conversations at midnight, turning passing doubts into relentless questions. The more evidence she quietly assembled, the heavier that weight became. She was no longer simply observing a questionable alliance, she was living with the knowledge of it. And that knowledge began to feel like complicity. The emotional toll was subtle at first, a guarded tone in private discussions, a hesitance when Camilla entered the room. Moments of isolation where Sophie, once confident in her role, felt like an outsider within her own family. She had built her identity on trust and steadiness, yet now she found herself navigating internal conflict that eroded that certainty. Loyalty to the crown had always guided her decisions. But what happens when loyalty to the institution clashes with loyalty to truth? The triggering moment did not arrive as a dramatic public spectacle. It was quieter than that, more personal, more cutting. A revelation that suggested the alliance was not merely historical but ongoing. A confirmation that the disgraced royal's influence might soon intersect with decisions carrying global consequences. For Sophie, that was the breaking point. What had once seemed like a questionable association now appeared poised to affect the monarchy's integrity in ways that could not be undone. Fear was real. She understood the cost of challenging someone as powerful as Camilla. The monarchy thrives on unity. Dissent is rarely tolerated at senior levels. Speaking out could mean isolation, loss of influence, perhaps even quiet exile from the inner circle she had served so faithfully. Yet remaining silent felt worse. It meant surrendering her principles. It meant accepting that calculated secrecy outweighed accountability. The confrontation, when it came, was not theatrical. It was controlled, deliberate, and charged with restrained emotion. Sophie presented what she knew not as accusation, but as undeniable pattern. Dates, annextions, intermediaries. The disgraced royal's shadow woven into too many threads to dismiss. Camilla's response, measured and composed, reportedly did little to ease the tension. Denials were cautious, explanations incomplete. The space between them filled not with resolution, but with an unmistakable realization: the alliance was real enough to defend. In that moment, Sophie made a choice. Not impulsively, not out of anger, but from conviction. She would no longer carry the burden alone. The risk was staggering. She could be branded disloyal. She could lose the very standing she had spent decades building. But history has a way of judging silence more harshly than courage. And Sophie understood that once she stepped forward, there would be no retreat. The decision to expose everything was less about vengeance and more about preservation. Preserving the monarchy's credibility before whispers hardened into scandal beyond control. Yet she knew the cost would be personal. Relationships would strain, alliances would fracture. And the palace, once her refuge, might become a battleground of perception and power. And when the truth finally surfaced, it didn't just shake the palace, it sent shockwaves across the world. The walls of Buckingham Palace have witnessed centuries of secrets, but rarely one this explosive. As Sophie's revelation spread, panic set in. Meetings were called. Statements were drafted. Loyalties were questioned. Because this wasn't just a scandal, it was a crisis that threatened the very foundation of the monarchy. Within hours of Sophie's disclosure, senior royals were drawn into urgent consultations. What had begun as a private reckoning now demanded a coordinated response at the highest level. Advisors moved swiftly, weighing every word that might be spoken publicly. Some argued for immediate denial, insisting that silence would only fuel speculation. Others urged caution, warning that any misstep could validate the allegations. The atmosphere was tense, not because the monarchy had never faced controversy, but because this one came from within. It was not an external attack, it was an internal fracture. Efforts to manage the narrative began almost instantly. Draft statements circulated, carefully neutral in tone, emphasizing unity and continuity. Language was scrutinized for hidden admissions. Behind closed doors, conversations grew sharper. Was this an overreaction fueled by misinterpretation? Or had Sophie exposed a vulnerability that could no longer be concealed? The line between damage control and quiet suppression blurred dangerously. Transparency, long championed as the monarchy's shield in modern times, now felt like a double-edged sword. Division within the royal family became impossible to ignore. Some members reportedly sympathized with Sophie's position, recognizing the weight of her character and the gravity of her claims. Others viewed her actions as destabilizing, a breach of the unspoken code that prioritizes collective image over individual conviction. The divide was not loud or theatrical, it was subtle, reflected in shifts of tone, in alliances recalibrated overnight. Trust, once assumed, now felt conditional. Outside palace gates, the reaction was immediate and relentless. Media outlets seized upon the story with urgency. International commentators questioned the implications of an alleged alliance with a disgraced foreign royal. Social platforms erupted with speculation, each theory amplifying the sense that something far larger than personal conflict was unfolding. The monarchy, accustomed to managing narratives with measured precision, found itself racing against an information cycle that moved faster than any official clarification could contain. Public trust became the central concern. The Crown's authority rests not on political power, but on perception, on the belief that its members operate above controversy, guided by duty rather than hidden agendas. Sophie's revelation challenged that perception directly. If a senior royal could maintain a covert alliance beyond official oversight, what else might be concealed? The question lingered heavily, unspoken yet impossible to dismiss. Inside the palace, strategic debates intensified. Was this a matter of issuing clarifications and allowing time to diffuse the storm? Or did the situation require deeper acknowledgement, perhaps even accountability at unprecedented levels? Each option carried risk. Denial without proof could erode credibility further. Admission could open the door to scrutiny that reached far beyond the original allegation. As tension mounted, one unsettling possibility began to surface among those closest to the crisis. What if the alliance, controversial as it appeared, was not an isolated misjudgment, but part of a broader strategy? What if the true implications extended beyond personal relationships and into the realm of influence, leverage, and long-term positioning? But even as the palace scrambled to contain the fallout, a darker question began to emerge. What was the true purpose of this alliance? Secrets are rarely kept without reason, and alliances like this don't exist without purpose. As investigators and the public began digging deeper, a chilling possibility emerged. What if this wasn't just about influence? What if it was about control? About reshaping power behind the scenes in ways no one could see? Until now, the first theory was almost comforting in its simplicity: personal loyalty. Perhaps Camilla believed she was extending support to a figure unfairly cast aside. Perhaps this was private sympathy disguised as diplomacy. But the deeper analysts looked, the less convincing that explanation became. The alleged interactions were too structured, too consistent, too carefully shielded. This did not resemble spontaneous compassion. It looked strategic. Another possibility began to take shape: political leverage. The disgraced royal, though publicly diminished, still possessed connections in influential financial and governmental networks abroad. An alliance could provide indirect access to corridors of power beyond Britain's formal reach. Quiet coordination might allow agendas to align without official endorsement, offering plausible deniability while securing mutual advantage. In a world where optics define legitimacy, unofficial partnerships can become powerful tools. Financial motivations also entered the conversation. Shared philanthropic ventures, cross-border initiatives, and private investment structures raised questions about resource flow. Not overt corruption, but subtle redirection. If both parties benefited from aligned projects through influence, funding pathways, or enhanced prestige, the relationship would carry tangible rewards. And tangible rewards create incentive for secrecy. Strategically, such a partnership could serve as a safeguard. For Camilla, cultivating influence beyond traditional frameworks might strengthen her personal standing within the monarchy's evolving hierarchy. For the disgraced royal, alignment with Britain's royal core could offer a pathway back to relevance, if not rehabilitation. Together, they might create a quiet axis of soft power capable of shaping narratives across continents without formal acknowledgement. But with strategy comes risk. The monarchy's global standing rests on neutrality and trust. Any suggestion that internal figures are maneuvering outside established diplomatic channels threatens that delicate balance. International allies could interpret the alliance as interference. Domestic critics could frame it as betrayal of public confidence. What appears as clever positioning in private could explode into reputational damage if exposed precisely the scenario now unfolding. More unsettling still is the possibility that this alliance was only one thread in a larger tapestry. Royal structures, by their nature, contain layers invisible to the public. Advisors, benefactors, long-standing personal relationships, each capable of influencing direction without overt authority. If one concealed partnership existed, could others have flourished unnoticed? Sophie's revelation might not represent the end of discovery but the beginning. Within palace walls, some began to consider whether the alliance had been tolerated quietly by select insiders who understood its strategic value. Not necessarily endorsed, but permitted. If so, the crisis deepens. It shifts from individual judgment to institutional culture. It suggests a network of silence designed to protect not just reputations, but calculated influence. And yet, even amid suspicion and theory, uncertainty remains. Was this alliance designed to shield the monarchy from external pressure? To create leverage in an unpredictable geopolitical climate? Or was it driven by personal ambition masked as prudence? The ambiguity fuels tension because clarity would either condemn or absolve, and neither outcome feels imminent. For Sophie, these questions are no longer abstract. They justify her decision, reinforce her conviction that secrecy of this magnitude cannot remain buried without consequence. But for the monarchy, the stakes extend far beyond personal disagreement. They touch on legitimacy, continuity, and survival in a world increasingly intolerant of concealed agendas. The alliance's true purpose may never be fully acknowledged in official terms, yet its shadow now looms openly, forcing conversations once confined to whispers. And as speculation deepens into scrutiny, as narratives harden into belief, the institution faces a crossroads unlike any in recent memory. And as the world watches, one final question remains: what happens next? The monarchy has survived wars, scandals, and revolutions, but this feels different. Because this time, the threat didn't come from the outside. It came from within. As the dust begins to settle, the future of the crown hangs in the balance. And the truth, once revealed, can never be buried again. For generations, the royal family has relied on resilience as its defining strength. Public storms would rage, criticism would intensify, yet the institution endured by projecting unity and stability. But this crisis is not a fleeting headline. It is a fracture that forces the monarchy to confront uncomfortable questions about transparency, loyalty, and internal accountability. The long-term implications stretch far beyond the individuals involved. If trust erodes at the highest levels, the symbolic foundation of the crown weakens. And symbolism, more than authority, is what sustains it. Sophie's position now stands on uncertain ground. To some, she will be remembered as courageous the royal who chose principle over silence. To others, she may be seen as disruptive, a figure who prioritized revelation over cohesion. Within palace walls, her relationships will inevitably shift. Invitations may become measured, conversations guarded. Yet there is also the possibility that her decision redefines her legacy, positioning her not as a quiet supporter of tradition, but as a catalyst for reform. Whether that transformation secures her influence or isolates her further remains an open question. Camilla's future is equally complex. If the allegations continue to circulate without resolution, her authority risks gradual erosion. Even absent formal consequences, perception alone can alter standing. Allies may distance themselves. Public engagements may carry unspoken tension. And if additional information surfaces, if further links to the disgraced foreign royal emerge, the pressure could intensify beyond containment. Yet Camilla is no stranger to controversy. Her rise to prominence was built on endurance. The coming months will determine whether resilience once again defines her trajectory, or whether this chapter marks a turning point impossible to reverse. Public perception now holds extraordinary power. Modern audiences demand openness. They scrutinize inconsistencies and amplify suspicion at unprecedented speed. The monarchy's ability to restore confidence depends not on silence, but on clarity. Yet clarity can be dangerous when secrets have already taken root. Every statement, every gesture will be interpreted through the lens of doubt. Rebuilding trust may require more than strategic communication, it may require transformation. There is also the lingering possibility that Sophie's revelation is not the final chapter. Patterns once exposed rarely remain isolated. Journalists, analysts, and observers will continue tracing connections. If the alleged alliance was part of a broader network of quiet influence, further disclosures could follow. Each new fragment would compound the impact, reshaping not only reputations but institutional norms. The scandal's endurance may not lie in its initial shock, but in its potential to unfold gradually, layer by layer. Ultimately, the legacy of this moment will be measured in years, not weeks. The monarchy's narrative, carefully crafted over centuries, now contains a chapter defined by internal dissent and concealed alliances. Whether it becomes a story of reckoning and renewal, or of division and decline, will depend on decisions still being made behind closed doors. What remains undeniable is that the crown can no longer rely solely on tradition to shield it from scrutiny. Because in the world of royalty, the most dangerous secrets aren't the ones that are told, but the ones still waiting to be uncovered. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.